Sekiro is one of the best games I have ever played in my entire life. I am Osa and this is my first impressions, thoughts on, and review for the captivating story, phenomenal experience, and head-scratching difficult game of Sekiro. One cannot mention Sekiro without its predecessors Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, and the massive recent hit Elden Ring. All of these games had almost the same formula: level up, dodge, and bunk bosses. A lot of bosses. Difficult bosses. These games can be very difficult if you chose to. The game provides the players with a lot of ways to beat around the difficulty of the bosses. NPC summons, player summons, variety of weapons, variety of playstyles, and more. And you have Sekiro, the final boss of Souls games. No leveling up, no random power-ups, no NPC summons, no co-op summons, and no weapons to choose from. Yet, I still think Sekiro stands out as the most uniquely designed game through its rich combat system, through its gorgeous semi-open world, through the phenomenal lore and its tight-knit story, and a rewarding experience that requires patience and the willingness to make mistakes to overcome the difficulties. Let us take a look at why Sekiro, though the hardest, might just be the best. The unique feel of the game. Sekiro is unique. It was released by FromSoft as a Souls game. That entails that it should be like Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, or Elden Ring. But no, this was one of the niche experiments FromSoft dared to embark on. The movement is different, infinite stamina, inner movement, grappling, and more. Dodging is not off the table, but it is situational. Most enemies will punish you for it. The combat is enriched with posture damage, variety of prosthetic tools, death blows, dodges, combat arts, and importantly, deflections. The focus is heavily on close combat with a system that rewards parries, also known as deflections. Trading blows with enemies make the combat very immersive. Combat extends to air, which brings the shinobi playstyle to another level. Often you'll see kanjis appear, which signifies certain attacks that are straight up skill checks. They have to be countered by either dodging, jumping, or Mikiri countering. Is a chair on top, the prosthetic tool adds a layer of depth to the combat system that makes it more immersive. All of these changes led to a very unique combat system that is very diverse from the traditional Souls format. These unique changes can also be felt in the design of the game. Power-ups are only locked behind bosses and mini-bosses. This change made the game very difficult, but rewarding if you chose to persevere. The introduction of a revive mechanic mid-combat eases the fights a lot. The progression is semi-linear with a lot of backtracking in what seems a semi-open world. The immersive story. Unlike any of the Dark Souls games, even the most recent one, Elden Ring, Sekiro in my opinion has one of the best well-written, well-told stories. Here is why. The world building and story exposition is top-notch. We are introduced into a well-organized story that is laid out in a well-organized world that is well-paced out. The story is not overshadowed by the fights, but elevated. In the other Souls, the stories tend to be abstract with a lot of windows for different interpretations, with a lot of details delivered through NPCs, item descriptions, and environmental details. While that might be great, it often leads to the primary focus being on boss fights rather than the story. However, Sekiro has a very clear story, highlighted with multiple cutscenes, enriched with the different ways Souls games deliver their unique lore. In fact, let us take a look at an example. Before that, spoiler warning. In the story, we are tasked by our foster father to protect Koro. Koro is the heir to the blood of the dragon, which grants immortality. After witnessing the corruption and burden of this immortality, we are tasked by him to put an end to it. Following such a request, we journey from the top of the castle to a closed area in the mountains in order to obtain a blade that severs the immortal. We find this temple area filled with corrupted monks who are experimenting with a water to try and gain immortality. Then we journeyed to different areas to obtain items needed for a ritual to ascend to the Fountainhead Palace. The Fountainhead Palace is where the Dragon of Immortality is located. Here's the kicker. The water in the Fountainhead is in contact with the Immortality Dragon and flows all the way to Miibu's village and is being concentrated and used by monks to experiment on children to be immortal. The only living child through those experiments is holding the blade that can sever the immortal. But what would you do? sever your immortality, Koro's immortality. Both of you, neither of you, play the game to find out. The lore is amazingly rich in the game, with almost everything being intentionally placed to complement the story. The story is at the forefront. The story is the primary focus. Context clues. One of the best things Sekiro excelled at, in my opinion, are context clues to help the players deal with the challenging difficulties. If you carefully clear areas, you get across so many hints that sometimes render some boss fights trivial. As examples, you can eavesdrop on an NPC that is mourning the death of his horse, due to it freaking out over gunpowder. Right around the corner is a boss that rides a horse. You eavesdrop on some soldiers discussing the effectiveness of fire against ogres. Right around the corner is an ogre boss. You get the idea. You don't have to search for a way to handle a fight. Most of the clues you need are laid out for you in-game. The creative design. Sekiro has no switch to lower the difficulty. Items that empower you are locked behind powerful bosses. The bosses hit really hard and are very punishing. All of these made Sekiro hands down one of the most difficult games out there, but it is not that difficult. Hear me out. The game is balanced in a genius way that if you persist long enough and pay attention to little details, you will be rewarded. Like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, the bosses are very far and in between, so you're not immediately stomped from one fight to another. The mini bosses, especially in early game, serve to teach you mechanics of the game that are very important in a very subtle way. As examples, the first mini boss, Shigenori, highlights the importance of deflection. You can brute force him, which I did too, by dodge hitting. The second mini boss, General Naomori, slightly introduces you to the importance of paying attention to kanjis and deflection. You can brute force him, which I did too, by dodge hitting. The third mini boss, Inching, stresses the importance of kanjis, and I mean stresses to a point. If you did not purchase the Mikiri counter, you shall not pass. Also, as another example, remember the gunpowder we talked about in context clues? That is the first boss you are supposed to fight that teaches you the importance of prosthetic tools. I feel like brute forcing, the impatience and treatment of Sekiro like a Souls game lead to a lot of the difficulties people face and the imminent rage quit. The fact that this game is difficult and rewards your efforts make it 10 times better. If you're fighting a final boss, you know it is a final boss. Let us take a look at some of the criticisms of Sekiro. The difficulty and learning curve. Sekiro has its flaws like any other game. One cannot deny the learning curve compared to other games, including Dark Souls, is very steep. Sometimes can be very overwhelming. As an example, you are introduced to Hirata Estate very early game. If you manage to make it to the Butterfly Lady, you will get stomped repeatedly. Let's say you persist and sweat for hours, you finally manage to bring her down, to find out she has a secret hidden phase that is even more insane. That is a Dark Souls experience in a nutshell. The game expects you to realize the difficulty and leave till later, which most people do not do. This leads to frustration and just pure rage. Not only that, but unlike the other Souls, you don't have access to summons or co-ops for that boss fight. It is just you and the boss alone. That makes the game a nightmare for a lot of people. Hell, I beat Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, and Elden Ring, and went into Sekiro thinking, what if I cannot finish the game? That is a thought I never had to deal with playing other games. The reputation of Sekiro definitely precedes it and lives up to it. Excessive backtracking. Sekiro's design include a lot of backtracking, which I found at times very jarring. You have to revisit Hirata's estate, outskirts, castle, and the mountain temple multiple times, which can be very tedious. At times you are left with the feel of, oh shit, here we go again. Not to mention that it was very off-putting to find out that the endgame takes place in the starting areas. Thematically makes sense, but it just feels off having to go through areas you have discovered before, which are now quote-unquote locked. Sidetracking. The semi-open world can create a very confusing experience at times. You can have access to almost all of the areas, which can get you easily sidetracked. Not only that, but you end up venturing into an area that you're not supposed to be at and immediately get stomped. This is something I experienced in my playthrough where I missed the temple and headed to Ashina's depths and turned out a lot harder than it was supposed to be. At the end of the day, this comes off as a side effect of having a semi-open world, so pick your you're poisoned. For some extra juice, here's my tier list of the boss difficulty from a blind run perspective. Beesh.